The house had always been more than just walls and a roof. It was a repository of my life, layer upon layer of memories pressed into the very foundation. Daniel and I built it, literally with our own hands. Brick by brick, dream by dream, every floorboard creak was a whisper from the past. Every sunbeam filtering through the kitchen window held the warmth of moments long gone. It was here I brought my babies home. Here they took their first steps. Here we celebrated Christmases and birthdays, gathered around the worn pine table that now groaned under the weight of a different kind of gathering. My daughter Sarah and her husband Mark had moved in 6 months ago. A temporary arrangement. They'd promised, just until they found their footing. Until Mark's brilliant, absolutely certain business venture took off. I remember the conversation, sitting right here at this table, the late afternoon sun painting stripes across the wood. Sarah, her face earnest, almost pleading, promising it wouldn't be a burden, that they'd help out, contribute. Mark, all smiles and easy charm, talking about family, about how wonderful it would be to have us all close. They spoke of contribution, of shared responsibility, of a future where they'd be on their feet, perhaps even helping me. I, ever the optimist. Or perhaps just a mother who desperately wanted to believe her child. Agreed. This house was big enough, I told myself. It had always been a place of warmth and welcome. How foolish that sounds now, echoing in the silence of these walls. The silence that fell the moment Sarah uttered those words across the very table where she'd sworn they wouldn't be a burden. The air in the dining room that evening was thick with unspoken resentments, a familiar atmosphere whenever Sarah and Mark were around. It wasn't just the tension, it was the pervasive sense of taking. They took up space, they took my quiet, they took my resources, and most gallingly they took my patience for granted. Mark was expounding, as usual, on the intricacies of his revolutionary app idea. A concept that sounded suspiciously like a dozen other failed ventures he'd pitched over the years. Sarah nodded along, contributing saccharine platitudes about innovation and seizing the future, while subtly piling the most appealing cuts of roast chicken onto her plate. I watched them, a knot tightening in my stomach, the same knot that had been there for weeks, months even. It wasn't just about the groceries disappearing faster than I could buy them, or the utility bills doubling, or the constant low hum of their television late into the night. It was the way they looked at me, or rather the way they didn't look at me, as if I were part of the furniture, a convenient fixture in their lives. My opinions were quaint, my routines were nuisances, my very presence seemed to be an inconvenience, unless I was actively doing something for them. I poured another glass of water, my hand steady despite the tremor starting deep within. I had spent my life giving, to Daniel, to my children, to my community. Giving was woven into the fabric of my being. But this felt different. This felt like being drained, like my well was running dry, and they simply stood by with their buckets, demanding more, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent to the fact that there was nothing left to give. The conversation drifted to their plans, always their plans, their needs, their future that I was apparently meant to facilitate indefinitely. Sarah sighed dramatically, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face with a gesture that spoke volumes of feigned exhaustion. "It's just so hard, Mom," she'd said, her voice dripping with self-pity. "Everything costs so much. We just need a little more time to get on our feet. It's such a burden." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Burden. She had called me a burden. Not her situation, not the financial strain, not the difficulty of finding work. I was the burden. The woman who had opened her home, shared her life savings, when Mark's last scheme imploded, stayed up nights worrying about them, now deemed a weight around their necks. Time seemed to stretch and distort. I saw Sarah's face, framed by the soft glow of the dining room chandelier, her expression a mixture of weary entitlement and casual cruelty. She wasn't even looking at me as she said it. She was spearing a piece of chicken, her attention already drifting back to Mark's endless monologue. Mark chuckled, a low, dismissive sound, and added, "Yeah, it's tough, Eleanor, Really appreciate you helping us out though. Don't know what we'd do without this place. It's a lifesaver. A lifesaver they seemed determined to treat with utter contempt. The irony was a bitter taste on my tongue. They called me a burden while clinging to my home like barnacles. My heart, which had been a tight, painful knot moments before, suddenly felt vast and empty, as if something precious had shattered inside. It wasn't just the word, it was the casualness, the absolute lack of awareness or gratitude. It was the culmination of 6 months of being treated like a live-in ATM and maid, coupled with a lifetime of putting their needs before my own. In that instant, the deep-seated resignation I had carried for so long, the quiet acceptance of my role as the ever-giving matriarch, fractured. A different feeling, cold and clear, began to spread through the emptiness. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was a chilling certainty, a stark realization that I had allowed myself to be diminished, to be erased, in my own home, by the very people I had cherished most. The house, my sanctuary, had become their fortress, and I, its builder and keeper, was merely a phantom haunting its halls. And they saw me not as the foundation, but as a crack in the wall. That night, sleep offered no escape. The word echoed in the darkness, burden. It replayed in my mind, each syllable a tiny, sharp stone thrown into the calm pool of my carefully constructed composure. I lay in my bed, in the room that felt less and less like mine, listening to the muffled sounds of their lives on the other side of the wall. Laughter, the television's distant murmur. It was a sound that used to bring me comfort, knowing my family was near. Now it was an intrusion, a constant reminder of their presence, their imposition, their utter disregard. I thought of the years, all the years, the sacrifices that weren't sacrifices at the time, because they were made out of love, working 2 jobs when Daniel was sick to keep this house, this very house, afloat, putting Sarah through college, even when she changed majors 3 times and seemed more interested in the social scene than her studies, helping her with rent checks, long after she should have been self-sufficient. And then, after Daniel passed, the quiet loneliness that settled in, the house feeling too large, too silent. Their arrival had initially felt like a balm, a return to a semblance of family life, a noisy, chaotic warmth that chased away the silence. But the warmth had proven to be parasitic, feeding off my emotional and financial reserves without offering anything in return but contempt. The casual cruelty of Sarah's remark wasn't an isolated incident. It was the loudest expression of a truth that had been whispering around the edges of my life for months. I was old. I was in the way. I was useful only for what I could provide, and even that provision was seen not as a gift, but as an obligation they were somehow tolerating. Lying there in the suffocating dark, I finally understood. This wasn't just about a thoughtless comment at dinner. This was about a fundamental lack of respect, a deep-seated sense of entitlement that saw my home, my resources, my very being, as theirs, for the taking. And I had, through my own inaction, my own desire for peace, and a connection that no longer existed, allowed it. But the realization brought with it a strange clarity. The emptiness in my chest began to fill, not with pain, but with a cold, hard resolve. The silence of the house seemed to shift, no longer oppressive but expectant. My house. It was still my house. And the burden, it seemed, was not me. The burden was them. And burdens, I realized, with a steeliness that surprised me, could be lifted. The morning after the dinner, the air was thick with an unacknowledged tension. Sarah and Mark bustled through the kitchen, their usual boisterous energy a little subdued, like children who knew they'd misbehaved, but hoped it would be overlooked. They made a show of being helpful. Mark offering to make coffee, Sarah asking if I'd slept well, their eyes not quite meeting mine. It was a pantomime of normalcy, a transparent attempt to smooth over the jagged edges of the previous night. I watched them, my expression neutral, the calmness I hadn't felt in months settling over me. It wasn't forced, it was the eerie stillness that precedes a storm. Inside, my mind was racing, sorting through decades of memories, assembling a case, A silent indictment. I remembered the promises, the forgotten birthdays, the times I'd been asked for money with a breezy assurance it would be repaid. It never was. The way they'd rearranged my furniture without asking. Small invasions that added up to a complete disregard for my space, my boundaries. I thought of Daniel, of how proud he was of this house, of our life here. He would never have allowed this. He saw my strength, not my vulnerability. He built me up. They tore me down, piece by piece, while they chattered about their plans for the day, completely omitting any mention of the burden comment. I moved with a quiet purpose. I made my own tea, ignoring Mark's offer of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, not with them, but across the room, giving myself space. I looked out the window at the old oak tree in the backyard, its branches bare against the winter sky, steady and enduring, like this house. Like me. I had spent years bending, accommodating, trying to keep the peace, trying to preserve a family connection, and I saw clearly was based on convenience for them, not genuine affection or respect. But the bending had reached its limit. Something inside me had straightened, becoming rigid and unbreakable. The calm I felt was not resignation. It was the quiet determination of someone who has finally decided to stop being acted upon and start acting. It was the beginning of taking my life, my home, back. And the first step, the crucial, irreversible step, involved paperwork, uncomfortable conversations, and a swift, clean break. The lawyer's office was hushed and smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Mr. Davison was a man of quiet competence. His movements precise, his gaze steady and understanding. I sat across from him. The worn deed to my house spread on the polished mahogany desk between us. It felt surreal. Discussing eviction with my daughter and son-in-law as the subjects, I explained the situation. The months of living arrangement, the lack of contribution, the growing disrespect, culminating in the dinner comment. Mr. Davison listened patiently, occasionally jotting down notes. He didn't express shock or judgment, only a quiet empathy that was surprisingly comforting. He asked about the initial agreement, the nature of their tenancy or lack thereof, as there was no formal lease, and the history. I spoke of the years, the help I'd given, the expectations that had clearly shifted from temporary assistance to permanent dependency. He explained the legal process for removing occupants who had established residency without a lease. It was straightforward if emotionally complicated, a notice to vacate, a specific time frame, the legal steps if they didn't comply. He explained the importance of doing everything correctly, by the book, to avoid complications. As he spoke, detailing the cold, legal facts, a strange sense of liberation settled over me. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This was a process, a logical, necessary process to reclaim what was mine. The house wasn't just a structure. It was my security, my history, my future. Allowing them to treat me, and it with such contempt, was a betrayal of Daniel's memory, of my own life's work. Mr. Davison handed me the necessary forms, explaining where to sign, how to serve them. He looked at me over his spectacles, a hint of something like admiration in his eyes. "It takes courage, Eleanor," he said softly, "to do what's right for yourself, even when it's difficult." Courage. I hadn't thought of it as courage. It felt more like necessity, like finally being able to breathe after being held underwater for too long. I left his office with the documents clutched in my hand, feeling the weight of them, a tangible manifestation of my resolve. The quiet dread I had carried was replaced by a determined focus. The time for being a burden was over. The time for reclaiming my space, my peace, had arrived. And the serving of the notice would be more than just a legal formality. It would be a statement. The week that followed was a strange ballet of suppressed emotions and calculated moves. Sarah and Mark, seemingly sensing a shift in the atmosphere, but perhaps attributing it to my moodiness or some other perceived failing of mine, continued their pattern of minimal contribution and maximum imposition. They left dishes in the sink, expected meals to appear, used the common areas as their personal lounge, filling the space with their noise and clutter. Each small act of thoughtlessness was a pinprick, adding to the growing reservoir of resolve within me. I watched them, my expression carefully neutral, my internal monologue a counterpoint to their oblivious presence. You complain about money, yet you order takeout 3 times a week on my Wi-Fi using my electricity. You call me a burden, yet you haven't offered to buy groceries in a month. You talk about your future, but you're living entirely in my past. I spent my days meticulously following Mr. Davison's instructions. I made copies of the notice, stored them safely. I documented every interaction, every instance of their behavior, not out of spite, but because Mr. Davison had advised it. It felt clinical, detached, and necessary. I moved through my routines, gardening, reading, visiting the market, with an outward calm that belied the storm gathering within. My conversations with them were brief and polite, offering no emotional hooks for them to latch onto or manipulate. They seemed slightly unnerved by my detachment, perhaps expecting the usual cycle of my quiet resentment building, then dissipating into weary acceptance. But that cycle was broken. A fragile peace settled over the house, a deceptive quiet before the inevitable upheaval. I felt a growing strength, a quiet power that came from knowing I had a plan, that I was taking control. The house felt different too. As I walked through the rooms, the weight of their presence felt less permanent. It was as if the walls themselves were anticipating the change, ready to shed the layer of foreign occupation and breathe freely again. I practiced what I would say, how I would deliver the notice. Calmly, clearly, without anger or apology. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about executing a decision. The emotional war had been fought and lost long ago. This was the administrative cleanup, the necessary final step to secure my borders. The chosen moment arrived with the inevitability of dawn. It would be after dinner, at the very table where the word burden had been so carelessly flung, the symbolic closing of a painful chapter. Dinner that night was a replay of many recent evenings, though my perception had fundamentally changed. Sarah chattered about a friend's new job. Mark was engrossed in his phone, occasionally grunting in response. The usual choreography of entitlement and passive consumption played out before me. I ate slowly, deliberately, tasting the food I had prepared, feeling grounded in the physical reality of the moment. My heart was pounding, a steady drumbeat against my ribs, but my hands were steady as I cleared my plate. They didn't offer to help, of course. They simply pushed their plates away and settled back, waiting for me to continue my role as the invisible service provider. The dishes could wait. There was something else to serve. I walked over to my desk in the corner of the dining room, a small antique bureau where I kept important papers. My movements were precise, unhurried. I could feel their eyes on me, a flicker of curiosity replacing their usual indifference. I retrieved the document, a plain white envelope containing the eviction notice. It felt strangely heavy in my hand. I returned to the table and stood at the head, where I usually sat. Sarah looked up, a slight frown creasing her brow. Mark finally put down his phone, his gaze sharp with something like suspicion. The air thickened again, but this time it was not with unspoken resentment, but with anticipation. I laid the envelope on the table, sliding it towards Sarah. Her name was typed neatly on the front, alongside Mark's. "What's this, Mom?" she asked, her voice already tinged with annoyance. I looked at them, truly looked at them, perhaps for the first time in months without the filter of hope or disappointment. I saw not my daughter and her husband, but 2 people who had mistaken kindness for weakness, generosity for obligation. My voice when I spoke was low but clear, devoid of the emotion that churned beneath the surface. "This," I said, gesturing to the envelope, "is something you need. It's a notice to vacate." The silence that followed was deafening. It swallowed the ambient sounds of the house, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Sarah stared at the envelope, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mark's face, moments before relaxed, contorted into a mask of stunned anger. "What?" What are you talking about? Mark finally sputtered, pushing back from the table. His voice was harsh, accusatory. Sarah picked up the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she fumbled with the flap. "A notice to vacate?" she whispered, looking up at me, her disbelief giving way to a dawning horror. "Mom, what is this? Is this some kind of joke?" I remained standing at the head of the table, my posture straight, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. I felt a surge of power, quiet and contained, like a tightly coiled spring. "It's not a joke, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "It's exactly what it says. It's a formal request for you to leave the premises, by the date specified inside." Sarah's eyes scanned the document rapidly, her face paling. 30 days? She gasped. "You're kicking us out? Your own daughter?" Mark slammed his hand on the table. "Are you serious, Eleanor? After everything, where are we supposed to go?" His charm had vanished completely, replaced by naked aggression. "You called me a burden last night, Sarah," I said, the memory of the words still sharp. "You made it clear how you feel about my presence in my own home. I've given you 6 months, far longer than we initially agreed. You haven't contributed meaningfully, you haven't respected my space, and you've shown a complete lack of gratitude." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. A familiar tactic. "How can you say that? We love you. This is our family home." "This is my home," I corrected, my voice firm. "And you've made it clear that you don't see me as the owner, but as a free ride. I can't live like this anymore. I deserve to live in my home in peace and feel respected. Since you are unable or unwilling to provide that respect, it's time for you to find somewhere else to live." Mark stood up, towering over the table, his fists clenched. "You can't do this. We have rights." "I've consulted with legal counsel," I replied calmly, meeting his furious gaze, without flinching. "I am following the proper procedure. You have 30 days. The power dynamic had completely inverted. For months, they had held the power of their presence, their demands, their emotional manipulation. Now the simple piece of paper in Sarah's trembling hand, backed by my quiet resolve and legal process, stripped them of that power. Their shock wasn't just at the notice, it was at my transformation, at the woman standing before them who was no longer willing to be their doormat. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of accusations and emotional theatrics. Sarah dissolved into loud sobs, accusing me of being heartless, of abandoning my own family. Mark paced the dining room, his face a dark storm cloud, muttering threats about lawyers and how I couldn't just throw them out. Their carefully constructed facade of polite dependency had crumbled, revealing the raw entitlement and anger beneath. "How could you do this, Mom?" Sarah wailed, burying her face in her hands. "After everything we've been through? After all the help you promised?" "I promised to help you get back on your feet," I stated, folding my arms across my chest. "Not to house and feed you indefinitely while you show no effort or respect. The help was a temporary bridge, not a permanent foundation for you to build your lives on, using my resources." Mark stopped pacing, pointing a finger at me. "We've paid for groceries. We've helped out. You've occasionally bought milk and bread," I countered coolly, "while consuming 10 times that value in everything else. And helping out hasn't extended beyond basic tightness. Certainly not contributing to utilities or property taxes, which are significant burdens, wouldn't you say?" The word deliberately echoed back at them, landed like a small explosion. Sarah flinched, her sobs momentarily halting. Mark's face darkened further. "So this is about that?" he sneered. "You're kicking us out because Sarah made a comment. How petty can you get?" "It's not just about the comment, Mark," I said, my voice rising slightly, finally allowing a fraction of my suppressed frustration to show. "It's about what that comment represented. It represented 6 months of being treated like a convenience, 6 months of your promises evaporating, 6 months of watching you take and take without any thought for me or my needs, in my own home. It was the moment I realized that you don't see me as your mother or host. but as a barrier to your comfort, a source of things you feel entitled to. And I am done being treated that way. Their protests continued, a torrent of self-pity and indignation. They tried guilt, reminding me of past favors they had done, trivial things compared to the years of support I'd provided. They tried intimidation, citing laws they clearly didn't understand. They even tried appealing to my supposed loneliness, suggesting I must want them here because I was alone. That stung, but I held firm. My loneliness is my own, I said quietly, and it is far preferable to the loneliness of being invisible in my own home, surrounded by people who wish I wasn't here. The serving of the notice wasn't just an action. It was a boundary drawn with the sharpness of a legal document. It was me finally saying, no more. And in the face of that definitive no, their superficial charm and feigned helplessness crumbled, revealing the ugliness beneath. The days that followed were a tense stalemate. Sarah and Mark didn't immediately pack. Instead, they embarked on a campaign of passive aggression and subtle resistance. Doors were slammed a little harder. The common areas were left messier than usual. The volume of the television seemed to creep up. They spoke in hushed tones when I was near, clearly discussing me, their eyes flicking towards me with resentment. It was a childish rebellion, a desperate attempt to regain control by making my life as uncomfortable as possible, within the confines of my own home. I maintained my calm, moving through the house with deliberate purpose. I ate my meals alone in the kitchen. I spent more time in my room, reading or working in the garden. I avoided engaging with their provocations. I knew this was part of it, the inevitable backlash from people who are used to getting their way. It was unpleasant, emotionally draining, but I reminded myself daily why I was doing this. I wasn't doing it to punish them. I was doing it to save myself, to reclaim my peace, to restore the sanctity of my home. I contacted Mr. Davison again, informing him of their reaction. He wasn't surprised. They'll likely try to make things difficult, he advised. Just continue to document everything. Maintain your position. Do not engage in arguments. If they become threatening or refuse to leave by the deadline, we will take the next legal steps. The law is on your side, Eleanor. Knowing that provided a quiet strength. Their bluster and anger couldn't change the fact that I had followed the process, that the notice was valid, that the deadline was approaching. They talked about getting their own lawyer, about fighting this. I simply nodded and went about my business. Let them. They would find that the law, unlike me, was not susceptible to their manipulations or sob stories. This phase of the process was the emotional grind, the test of my resolve. Every slammed door was a challenge, every resentful look, a barb. But with each challenge, my resolve hardened. I had endured years of subtle erosion of my boundaries. I could certainly endure a few weeks of overt hostility. The house, witnessing this silent battle, felt heavy, filled with unspoken words and simmering anger. But beneath the tension, there was also a growing sense of anticipation, of an approaching release. The air wasn't stagnant. It was charged, crackling with the energy of impending change. As the deadline on the notice drew closer, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. Sarah and Mark's passive aggression escalated into outright hostility. They stopped speaking to me altogether, communicating only through venomous notes left on the kitchen counter or through shouted accusations from their room. They deliberately used up supplies without replacing them, left lights on, and created noise at all hours. It was a clear attempt to force me to either back down or lash out, but I refused to give them the satisfaction. I continued to live my life, purchasing my own groceries, using only my personal space when possible, and counting down the days. The silence between us was a wall, thick and impenetrable, built of years of unspoken grievances, and now the undeniable reality of my action. I spent hours in the garden, even in the cold, finding solace in the rhythm of nature, the steady, unyielding cycle of growth and decay. It was a reminder that change, even difficult change, was a natural part of life. I thought about Daniel often during this time, imagining what he would say. He would be proud. I thought, proud that I was standing up for myself, for our home. He always saw my strength, even when I didn't. There was a moment, a few days before the deadline, when Sarah cornered me in the kitchen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face drawn. For a second, I saw a flicker of the child she once was, the little girl who used to cling to my hand. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking, "please, don't do this. Where will we go? We have nowhere." The old Eleanor, the one who would sacrifice anything for her children's comfort, felt a pang of guilt, a brief tremor in her resolve. But then I remembered the word, burden. I remembered the casual cruelty, the months of disregard, the fundamental disrespect. I remembered the feeling of being erased in my own home. I looked at her, my expression sad but firm. "You had somewhere, Sarah," I said softly. "You had a home here, but you didn't value it, and you didn't value me. That was your choice. Now you have to face the consequences." She recoiled as if I had struck her, her fleeting vulnerability replaced by anger. "Fine," she spat. "If you want us gone so badly, we'll go, and don't expect to hear from us again. You'll be all alone just like you wanted." She stormed off, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, the silence rushing back in. Her words were meant to wound, to make me doubt, to make me feel guilty, and yes, they did sting. The prospect of being truly alone in this large house was daunting. But the alternative, living as a burden in my own sanctuary, constantly diminished and disrespected, was far worse. Loneliness could be managed, disrespect tolerated indefinitely, was soul-destroying. The morning of the deadline arrived clear and cold. I woke before dawn, the house eerily silent. There were no sounds from their room. I got up, made my tea, and sat by the kitchen window, watching the sky lighten. A sense of calm had settled over me, a quiet anticipation. The battle was over. This was just the final act. As the morning progressed, I heard sounds of movement from their part of the house. Muffled thuds, scraping sounds, the quiet closing of doors. They were packing. They were leaving. I didn't approach them. I stayed in the kitchen, giving them their space, allowing them this last shred of dignity, or perhaps avoiding another confrontation. Around mid-morning, I heard heavier sounds, boxes being moved, the front door opening and closing. A van arrived in the driveway. I watched through the window as Mark and a couple of hired movers carried boxes out of the house, loading them into the van. Sarah emerged later, carrying a few bags. She didn't look towards the kitchen. She got into a car that was waiting and sat there, staring straight ahead. Mark supervised the loading, his face set and unreadable. There was no fanfare, no tearful goodbyes, no last-ditch attempts at reconciliation, just the quiet, methodical removal of their presence from my home. It felt anticlimactic, after all the emotional turmoil, all the tension, but perhaps that was fitting. Their departure wasn't a dramatic climax. It was the quiet, necessary conclusion to a relationship that had become unsustainable. As the last box was loaded and the van doors were closed, Mark walked over to the car where Sarah sat. He spoke to her for a moment, then came towards the front door, pausing on the porch. He didn't look at me directly, but his gaze swept over the house, a mixture of resentment and something that might have been defeat. He got into the car with Sarah, and they drove away. I remained by the window until the car was out of sight, and then there was silence. Real silence this time. Not the tense quiet of suppressed conflict, but the deep, resonant silence of an empty house. The silence was heavy, almost palpable. They were gone. Just like that. 6 months of their lives packed into boxes and driven away, leaving behind only empty spaces and the lingering scent of their presence. I walked through the house, slowly, tentatively, as if entering a place I hadn't seen in years. Their room was bare, stripped of their belongings. The closet was empty, the dresser drawers pulled out slightly, revealing nothing. It felt clean, like a wound that had finally been disinfected. I went into the living room, where Mark had dominated the sofa for months. The cushions were still indented from his weight. I smoothed them out, a small symbolic act of reclaiming the space. In the dining room, the table was just as it had been left after their final silent meal. I cleared the few remaining dishes, washed them meticulously, and put them away. As I tidied, a wave of emotion washed over me. It wasn't relief, not entirely. It was a complex tangle of feelings. Sadness for what was lost, for the relationship with my daughter that had fractured beyond repair, regret for the years I had allowed myself to be taken advantage of, and beneath it all, a quiet, burgeoning sense of peace. The house was mine again. Every room, every corner, every creak of the floorboards belonged to me and the memories I had made here. The air felt lighter, cleaner. The oppression I had felt for months lifted like a shroud being removed. I walked out into the garden, stepping onto the soil that I loved. The old oak stood tall and steady, its branches reaching towards the sky. It had seen generations come and go, seasons change. It endured, like the house, like me. The cost had been high. My relationship with Sarah might never recover. The dream of a close, loving family living together had shattered into a million pieces. But I had reclaimed my home, my peace of mind, my sense of self. I was no longer a burden. I was the owner, the keeper of the house, the architect of my own life. The silence was not emptiness. It was possibility. It was the quiet hum of a life that was, finally, truly my own again. The process had been painful, dramatic, and tense, but the bittersweet outcome was a hard-won freedom. I stood there, breathing in the cold, clean air, feeling the earth beneath my feet, and for the first time in a long time, I felt strong. Not in a loud, demanding way, but with a quiet, deep-seated strength that came from surviving and reclaiming what was lost. This house, this garden, this life, it was all mine, and no one could take it from me again.